There's a strong bias among the American people that when you face some economic or social problem in favor of the government doing something, and when you say, well, the government shouldn't do anything in response to this problem, or the government should do some limited thing in response to this problem, people kind of say, I don't know, that sounds radical. Gee, that's bad. I don't like that. People need health care and housing and education, and there should be less poverty. And you're saying that the government shouldn't fix these things is kind of how they react. When it comes to foreign crises, you have bad actors on the international stage. You have dictators, you have ayatollahs, you have Fidel Castro, you have Vladimir Putin. If you say, well, yes, these people are bad and they're maybe doing bad things, but we don't necessarily need to intervene in this particular crisis, or we don't necessarily need to project our strength by getting tough with these guys in quite the way that some interventionists are proposing, you get the same kind of responses when you are talking about why maybe the government shouldn't do this or that with regard to health care or poverty. It's like, gee, that's kind of radical and crazy. And like, if they don't do anything, Putin is going to be in my house tomorrow and he's going to annex it and everything will be terrible. But the interesting thing about it is you don't get these reactions, or you generally don't get these reactions. There are some exceptions, but you generally don't get these reactions from the same people. The people who understand, or are most likely to understand, that maybe government is not the answer or the solution to every domestic problem are generally the most likely to be skeptical of that answer when it's presented in foreign policy. And that really makes people advocating a libertarian foreign policy sort of men and women without a country. There's no, in our binary political system, no party, no constituency that's really speaking for that viewpoint, at least not with confidence and comfort. I think you can see the evidence of that in the vote for the Iraq War. The congressional vote for the Iraq War, we all remember that virtually all Republicans, there were only 7 who voted against authorizing the Iraq War. But it's less well remembered that many Democrats voted for it. Half the Democrats in the Senate voted to authorize the Iraq War. When we talk about people who voted the Iraq War, the list will include Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Richard Gephardt, Steny Hoyer, John Kerry, Chuck Schumer, Harry Reid. These are not backbencher Democrats. These are actually some of the leading and most prominent members of the party and people who are going to be presented in some cases as the Peace Party's next candidate for president of the United States. So that means that you really don't have, as Phyllis Schlafly and Barry Goldwater might say, a choice rather than an echo. You kind of have this sort of, Me Tooism even on the part of the Democrats. And in some respects that makes sense because the Democrats are the party that likes to think that the government can keep everybody safe all the time and in every situation. But some of it is also a relic of 1980s and 1990s politics, where a lot of these people came of age when the Democratic Party was perceived as weak on foreign policy, that it was perceived as not adequately standing up to the Soviets in the Cold War, sort of. Sometimes they'd call them isolationists, but really was more often they were viewed as sort of peacenik, hippie, liberal, kumbaya types. And a lot of Democrats internalized that critique and regarded it as a political liability that they were perceived in this way, and do all these things, in some cases which they don't even necessarily believe in, do all of these things to adapt to this political liability and to sort of say, no, I'm tough too. We'll be safe with President Hillary as safe as you will be with President Marco Rubio. The odd thing about that is it doesn't really reflect some of the trends in public opinion. It's certainly not the trends in public opinion among a lot of rank-and-file Democrats. But a lot of times what happens is when people sort of come of age politically, they kind of stick with the ideas that were, they adopted during their formative political years. So you have a generation of Democrats that is leading a party of people who are actually very hesitant to see such an outsized U.S. role in the world, and particularly the role that we're currently playing in the Middle East. They're being led by people who essentially want a more tepid version of what the most hawkish elements of the Republican Party advocate, or in some cases, not even a more tepid version. And you're seeing a lot of the replay of Iraq occurring with regard to the debate over Iran. Not that I'm suggesting that I think any military action is imminent, but a lot of the core assumptions that are being batted around by both parties while discussing, how to deal with the potential Iran nuclear threat are very similar to the core assumptions that kind of led us into the Iraq War. So what do we do about any of this? There was a period where we were seeing real growth in the libertarian wing of the Republican Party and some chastened conservatives who were sort of moving over more towards that viewpoint. But as we've seen, it's very easy to make those arguments on domestic policy when everything is going well and everything is prosperous. When there seems to be any instability in the world, it becomes much harder to make non-interventionist arguments in foreign policy. And the Republican Party seems at the moment to be reverting to form. But I don't think all is necessarily lost. I think the political incentives for even the best-intentioned libertarian-leaning Republicans are bad. They will be punished by the loudest voices on the right, or at least relatively penalized by saying anything that sort of deviates from we need to project force in the most aggressive way possible. And there's been a lot of success in framing a libertarian or non-interventionist foreign policy as Barack Obama's foreign policy. Now, I find that very interesting that a president who escalated one war, launched two wars without the approval of Congress, and proposed another one, is some kind of non-interventionist libertarian foreign policy president, but there you have it. And it's another example of how sort of the binary political system makes it hard to have some of these kinds of debates in a nuanced fashion. Another disadvantage, I think, for people who are in the Republican Party who are on the right is that if you are advocating a less interventionist foreign policy, there aren't as many people who could staff your national security team, advise you on foreign policy, be seen as a credible voice for you on foreign policy, who are willing to take and articulate these positions. A lot of people who are willing to take and articulate these positions either stay in academia, gravitate toward the Democratic Party, and so there are many more. For every person like some of my co-panelists here, there are 5 or 6 John Boltons in training who you could hire to advise you on foreign policy. So even if your instincts might be good, the advice that you're getting is not going to reinforce your instincts. And if you're looking to project that you are credible on these issues, you're going to have a hard time finding the academics with experience in government to staff these positions, because personnel to some extent is policy. And that leads into another area. One of the positives I think is that I've always argued that we need to get people who are engaged in economics and domestic policy, some of the more fiscal conservatives and libertarians who specialize in non-foreign policy areas, to make them be a little bit more vocal on foreign policy. I remember I was here during the whole the 2006 when there didn't seem to be a whole lot of open dissent within the Republican Party on foreign policy, but you quietly heard a lot of these conservative budget experts would kind of say, gee, I don't know that this Iraq war thing is such a great idea. I don't know. But they didn't really, being good disciples of Adam Smith, we practice this specialization. So, budget people talk about budget things, social conservatives talk about social things, and foreign policy experts and national security experts talk about foreign policy things. And the foreign policy experts we had were predominantly hawkish, neoconservative or interventionist and various other flavors. And, you'd hear these budget types saying, around 2006, 2007, when things clearly were not going well in Iraq, saying, gee, I don't know if these people we've hired to handle this foreign policy part of the right know what they're talking about. So there still needs, obviously, to be some foreign policy expertise that comes from a less interventionist perspective on the right. But I think in the meantime, before we can kind of cultivate those institutions and cultivate that talent in people, I think that there is a vacuum that needs to be filled by people who are philosophically sympathetic to a less interventionist foreign policy, but who specialize on other issues. I think that they shouldn't necessarily let the division of labor dictate what the Republican Party's foreign policy is going to be. I think another positive, since so far this talk has trended toward the negative, I think another positive is that the younger demographic within the Republican Party on the right is much less interventionist in its foreign policy thinking. Many of these people did not grow up during the height of the Cold War or have little memory of the Cold War. Their thinking was sort of developed in other paradigms. They have seen instead some of the negatives of intervention and some of the unintended consequences of intervention. That's what's occurred during their politically formative years. And a number of them were inspired to enter politics by Ron Paul, who certainly made relevant a lot of conservative and libertarian foreign policy arguments that had kind of lain dormant in the Republican Party, at the very least since Pat Buchanan's presidential campaigns in the 90s and maybe all the way back to when Robert Taft was around and kicking. So that, I think, is a positive development. But the structural incentives to always say yes to government remain. I think what libertarians need to do is need to redouble the effort of explaining to conservatives why a lot of their premises about domestic policy apply to foreign policy, even if you grant, as I do, that national defense is a legitimate and a preeminent power of the federal government. I also think, as we are seeing very fruitful alliances between civil libertarians across the political spectrum, it is important to engage the peace progressives who are large in number at this point in the Democratic Party, but often not reinforced by their leadership. I think you need to have ad hoc, case-by-case alliances with them on these issues because they provide a large number of the votes in Congress that can potentially defeat bad things and maybe eventually at some point shape us in the direction of some good things or move us in the direction of some good things. I think an encouraging example of that was when the president wanted to bomb Syria, and Secretary of State John Kerry went to Congress and said, come on, guys, this is just going to be an unbelievably small war. It's just a little one. Can't we just have one little, couple bombs here and there? It'll be fine. And Congress said no. And Congress said no because you had a core group of Tea Party Republicans that did not want to just hand that power over to the president. And you had a large group of progressive Democrats who said, you know what, I thought you were going to come in and be our peace president, so why are we having more war? And Congress was unwilling to go along with this mission. The challenge, I think, becomes on the right. It was easier to make that argument on the right because the less interventionist position was also an anti-Obama position. It was also a position that you could articulate from a politically opportunistic perspective. And you're never going to avoid the fact that most politicians, or at least a large number of politicians, are political opportunists. On things like Iran, you end up having it framed more like the less interventionist position is somehow the pro-Obama position. And so that makes it a little tougher for Republicans, but it doesn't necessarily make it tougher. In fact, it makes it easier for progressive Democrats. So I think we've seen sort of a template for how there can be a successful left-right coalition in favor of a less interventionist or more libertarian foreign policy. Where it kind of breaks down is when you have a Republican president advocating a more hawkish foreign policy. And the easiest answer would be to try to nominate a Republican president who is less hawkish, and we may have some hope to do that, but we may also, some of those other earlier problems that I've described with the biases of the primary electorate and the dearth of foreign policy advisors reinforcing good instincts, you may face some problems there. But I think overall, comparing to where things were in 2006, 2007, there's a lot more hope, even within the political system, than you would have had, than I thought would have been realistic by this point in time. So even with some skepticism that I have right now, I think if people stay engaged, continue to make these arguments, and continue to not just allow 5 people who want to plan wars to, obviously exaggerating, but to not allow the same familiar voices have a monopoly on foreign policy discussion, not just on the right, but also on the center left, I think we can continue to build on some of the progress that we've made in the last few years. And there's only so much you can accomplish in politics, but I think politics is a sort of defensive battle to prevent bad things from happening. To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, you go to war with the system that you have. So maybe we can go to war a little bit less.